The room felt ordinary, almost too ordinary. The kind of place where nothing appears out of place, where conversations move naturally, where people speak, react, agree, disagree, and leave without ever questioning the structure that holds it all together. And that is what made it so effective, because control rarely announces itself. It does not appear as force. It appears as normal, and what feels normal is rarely examined, and what is not examined is easily accepted, and the people in the room existed within that acceptance, not consciously, not deliberately, but naturally, because they had never been given a reason to see it differently. And at the center of that quiet system stood Friedrich Nietzsche, not resisting it, not confronting it directly, but observing it. And observation, when done correctly, reveals what participation conceals, because to see something clearly, one must step slightly outside of it. And Nietzsche stood at that edge, not entirely separate, but not entirely inside. And that difference created something subtle, something almost imperceptible, a quiet tension that did not yet have a name, but could be felt in the way attention began to shift, in the way people became aware of being observed, even if they did not understand why. And one of the men noticed it first, asking what Nietzsche was looking at, what exactly he found so interesting in something so ordinary. And the question was casual, almost dismissive, but beneath it there was something else, something close to discomfort, because people do not like the feeling of being seen in ways they do not understand. And Nietzsche did not answer immediately, and that pause created space, and space invites attention, and attention, when focused long enough, creates pressure. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost attached, and he said that the most effective form of control is the one that is not recognized as control. And the words did not land as an accusation. They landed as something more subtle, something that required interpretation. And the room reacted not with immediate resistance, but with confusion, because the statement did not align with any obvious reality. And when something does not align, the mind attempts to correct it, to reshape it into something familiar. And one of the men laughed, lightly at first, dismissing the idea, saying that no one in the room was being controlled, that they were free, that they chose their thoughts, their actions, their beliefs, and the laughter spread, not because it was understood, but because it restored comfort. And comfort is what people seek when something unfamiliar appears. And Nietzsche did not react, did not challenge the laughter, did not defend his statement. And that lack of reaction created something unexpected. Because when a man does not respond to dismissal, the dismissal begins to lose its force, and the laughter, though still present, became less stable, less certain, as if it required effort to maintain itself. And one of the men stepped forward again, this time more directly, asking what Nietzsche meant, asking whether he was suggesting that their thoughts were not their own, that their decisions were somehow influenced by something outside of them. And Nietzsche looked at him, not with confrontation, but with clarity, and said that most people do not notice control because it does not feel like force. It feels like choice. And the words moved differently this time because they were more precise, more direct, and the room felt it not as agreement, but as disruption, because now the idea had taken form, and form is harder to ignore, and the tension that followed was no longer subtle. It was present, visible in the way people shifted, in the way attention narrowed, in the way the room, once casual, became focused, and something had begun. The laughter did not disappear immediately, but it changed, becoming uneven, thinner, as if it no longer came from confidence but from habit. And habit, once exposed, begins to lose its strength, because it no longer feels natural. It feels repeated, and repetition, when seen clearly, creates distance between a person and what they're doing, and that distance is where awareness begins. And awareness is what the room had not expected, because it interrupts comfort, and comfort is what it held everything together until that moment. And now something had disrupted it, something small, something simple, but enough to create tension. And tension, once introduced, does not remain contained. It spreads slowly, quietly, from one person to another, not through agreement, but through presence. Because discomfort does not require consensus. It only requires awareness. And once awareness begins, it changes the way everything is experienced, the way words are heard, the way reactions are felt, the way a person observes themselves within the presence of others. And the people in the room felt that shift, even if they resisted it, because something had been introduced that did not fit with the structure they relied on. And when something does not fit, the mind tries to correct it, to dismiss it, to push aside. But dismissal requires certainty, and certainty had already begun to weaken, and one of the men stepped forward again, his voice more controlled now, less reactive, asking what Nietzsche meant more precisely, asking whether he was suggesting that people were being influenced without realizing it, that their thoughts, their beliefs, their decisions were not entirely their own, and the question carried resistance, but also something else, something less visible, something closer to unease, because the idea had begun to settle, not as an argument, but as a possibility, and possibilities are far more difficult to reject than statements, because they do not demand agreement. They simply exist, and Friedrich Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that control is most effective when it does not appear control, when it becomes indistinguishable from choice, and the words moved through the room differently this time, because they did not challenge directly. They redefined something fundamental, something people had always assumed without question, the idea that their thoughts were their own, and redefining something so deeply embedded creates instability, because it forces a person to reconsider what they have always accepted as certain, and that reconsideration is not comfortable. It does not resolve quickly, it lingers, it creates tension, and the room felt that tension deepen, not outwardly, but inwardly, because now each person had been drawn into the statement, not as an observer, but as a subject, and being a subject removes distance. And without distance, resistance becomes harder to maintain. And Nietzsche continued, saying that people are, shaped long before they become aware of it, influenced by language, by culture, by expectation, by the need to belong, and that these influences do not feel like control. They feel like identity. And that is what makes them so difficult to recognize, because what feels like self is rarely questioned. And the words settled into a room with quiet weight, because they did not demand reaction, they demanded reflection, and reflection is slower, heavier, more difficult to avoid, and the man who had spoken did not respond immediately, and that hesitation revealed something new, because earlier reactions had been immediate, automatic, but now something had interrupted that automatic response. Something had slowed it down, and once thought slows, it begins to deepen, and depth is where discomfort grows, and Nietzsche, seeing this, did not escalate, did not push harder, because the moment had already shifted, and escalation where broken would have begun to form. And instead, he said that the most dangerous form of control is not the one that forces obedience, but the one that creates the illusion of independence. And the words settled deeper than anything before them, because they did not accuse, they revealed, and revelation is far more difficult to resist, because it does not require agreement. It creates recognition, and recognition, once it begins, cannot be easily undone, and the room, once held together by shared certainty, now held something entirely different, something unstable, something unresolved, something that no longer responded to simple dismissal, and within that shift, something had already begun to break, even if no one was ready to admit it, because what they were feeling was not confusion. It was something far more unsettling, a quiet realization that what they called freedom might not have been entirely their own. And for the first time, the room was no longer certain, but had not yet understood what that uncertainty would demand. The room did not erupt, it held, but what remained was no longer the same, because something had shifted, not in what was said, not in what was visible, but in how it was being experienced. And that difference was enough to change everything, because once a person begins to question what feels natural, what feels automatic, what feels like their own, they cannot fully return to the state before that question existed, and the people in the room felt it, even if they did not fully understand it, because something had been introduced that did not require agreement to exist, something that had already begun to alter the way they saw themselves. And that alteration is what makes an idea dangerous, not because it forces change, but because it makes change unavoidable, and Friedrich Nietzsche stood within that space, not as someone who had imposed anything, but as someone who had revealed something that had always been there, hidden beneath habit, beneath repetition, beneath the quiet assumption that what feels natural must be true. And one of the men spoke again, his voice lower now, stripped of its earlier certainty, asking how a person could know whether their thoughts were truly their own. And the question carried something new, not resistance, not challenge, but fear. And fear is always more honest than certainty, because it appears when something real has been touched. And Nietzsche answered calmly, saying that most people never truly know, because they never stop to question what feels comfortable, and comfort is what keeps control invisible, because What feels comfortable is rarely examined, and what is not examined is easily accepted. And the words did not accuse, they revealed, and revelation is far more difficult to resist because it does not demand agreement. It creates recognition, and recognition, once it begins, cannot be easily undone, and the room fell silent. But this silence was not empty. It was heavy, filled with something that pressed inward rather than outward, because now each person present had been left alone with something they could not easily escape, the possibility that their choices, their beliefs, even their sense of self, had been shaped long before they became aware of it. And Nietzsche spoke once more, his voice steady, saying that the most effective form of control is not the one that limits what people can do, but the one that shapes what they believe they want. Because once desire itself is influenced, resistance becomes unnecessary, and the words settled deeper than anything before them, because they did not describe control as something external. They described it as something internal, something that moves through thought, through preference, through identity, and that is what makes it almost impossible to detect. And no one responded, because there was nothing to respond that would restore what had been there before. No argument that could return the room to its earlier simplicity. And Nietzsche turned and walked away, not waiting, not seeking reaction, his steps calm, unchanged as if nothing in him depended on the people he was leaving behind. And as he moved, no one stopped him, not because they agreed, but because something within them had already shifted, something that could not be undone through reaction alone. And as he disappeared from view, the room remained, but it was no longer the same, because once a person begins to question whether their thoughts are truly their own, they cannot fully return to the comfort of certainty. And what remained was not silence, but something far more unsettling, the quiet awareness that control does not need to be imposed when it has already been accepted, and that awareness does not leave easily. The room did not erupt, it held, but what remained was no longer the same.